All right. Hello, everyone. We'll get started here. So thank you for coming very much. So I'm Kerry King, Assistant Director at the University of Texas Energy Institute and Research Scientist there. So it's my pleasure to have you here for today's UT special edition of today's UT Energy Symposium sponsored by the Energy Institute. And this is also part of our weekly talks on energy this week that we call UT Energy Week. This is the 7th year of a conference on energy on our campus running this week. So today we have Bruce Niemeyer, and he's going to talk to us about Chevron's role in the future of energy. So here's his abstract. Today's global energy markets are being shaped by two primary forces, macroeconomic factors, and driving a rise in the world energy demand and global efforts to lower emissions. Affordable, reliable, and ever-clean energy is essential to human progress. Balancing these dynamics will be critical to the future of energy markets, and at Chevron, they are striving to deliver the future of energy in a low-carbon manner and are committed to leveraging their strengths to deliver lower-carbon energy to a growing world. So just a little background on Bruce before he comes on stage. He's Corporate Vice President of Strategy and Sustainability for Chevron Corporation, and he has had this role since 2018. He's responsible for guiding development of the company's key strategies, including capital allocation and sustainability efforts. Prior to his current role, he was Vice President of Chevron's Mid-Continent Business Unit from 2013 to 2018. And in that role, he's responsible for developing assets in the mid-continent United States, including significant Permian assets in Texas and New Mexico. He's also a member of the Oxford Energy Policy Club, and he comes to Chevron from Texaco in 2000, where he came from Atlantic Richfield Company. He has a bachelor's degree in petroleum engineering from the Colorado School of Mines. We won't hold that against him because his daughter attends UT Austin. And he's a registered petroleum engineer in the state of California. So with that introduction, I'd like to bring up our guest speaker for today, Bruce Niemeyer. We do have plenty of time for questions at the end, so we'll hold questions to the end of this talk. You can come to the microphone at the right of the stage, or we might walk one to you, so we'll be asking for you to ask questions when he's completed. All right. Bruce?
Thank you. Well, it's a pleasure to be with you, and truth be told, I couldn't get into UT, it's a pleasure to be here today because today I did get in. And it's really nice to see you all face to face. It's been too long that we've been in remote. We've been in an environment where we weren't able to do things like this, and I understand that this is the first of these talks that are now face-to-face again. And so I really appreciate those of you that made it out in the room today being here, and those online for joining us as well. So today I wanted to talk about the future of energy. And you really can't talk about the future of energy without starting by being grounded in the past, because it's been often said that what is past is prologue, and understanding where we've been will help us appreciate the challenges and uncertainties of things that'll be before us. So this is a chart of global total primary energy demand. This is the total energy that has been consumed by the world for 150 years. It is a system that is under a continual state of evolution and change. And you can see by looking at this chart, from 1870 all the way to 2021, energy has grown, with a particular acceleration of energy in the 1950s. The interesting thing to me about this chart is right here at the end. That's 2020 now, the year of the pandemic. And if you think about what you experienced in your personal life, did you go to remote learning here? Okay, so we went to remote work in Chevron. So everybody that was in our office buildings went home and worked remotely. We went to remote learning here. Birthday celebrations got missed. Bridal showers and weddings were deferred. Funerals weren't attended. Sporting events didn't occur. Rodeos were canceled. All of those things occurred during that period of time, and for me personally, and I suspect for you as well, it felt like a dramatic change as the world economy locked down and we fought the pandemic together. But look at the energy system. There was almost no change in the energy that was consumed, and it's a reflection of how big the energy system is and how much it operates in the backgrounds of our lives every day to enable the kind of living in the environment we're in. It's not just the travel, it's not just the gasoline you might put in the car, but it is the energy that moves goods and services, that allows the medical profession to respond to medical events, that does everything essential in the world. And that little dip right there is a couple percent of the entire energy being consumed prior to the pandemic. Our lives changed dramatically, but what we see in the energy system is like seeing the tip of a very large iceberg. And understanding what's going on behind the scenes is essential to understand what's going to come next. Now, there are two reasons why energy has grown like this. The first is population. Back in 1870, there was a little more than 1 billion people in the world. Today, there is 7.7 billion people in the world. And you can see the shape of this particular population chart pretty much matches the energy demand that I just showed you on the previous chart. As new people arrive on the planet, they're new consumers of energy in all form, whether it's for heating or cooking or mobility or the demand for goods and services. As new individuals arrive on the planet, they demand energy. And energy demand has long been correlated with population. It's also correlated with income. And what we find by study of individual countries and economies is that as individual income grows per person, energy use grows per person as well. And as overall income, represented by this chart, GDP in the world, as that grows in the world, so does energy demand. And it makes sense that as an individual moves from really having no energy to being able to light their home and heat their living environment, and then with a little more income seeks to use a different kind of energy to cook their food and refrigerate their food and broaden their choices, to mobility, to demanding goods and services that are supplied through complex supply chains, all of which consumes energy. And so country after country, as we look at different parts of the world, as income per person grows, so does energy per person. And these two drivers have long been correlated with the growth in energy demand overall. Where does that energy come from? Well, it comes from a variety of sources. So this top of this chart here is the exact same total primary energy demand that I showed you on the first chart. But now all these shadings are where that energy is supplied from. And it's changed over time. It's evolved over time. If you go back to the early 1900s, right here, it was a world principally of biomass, meaning burning of wood and animal dung, and coal. Biomass is this little green shading down here. Coal is that light gray. And in the 1900s, even actually for the next several decades, all the way through 1940, maybe even 1950, the world was principally powered by biomass and coal. Well, that's the long history of energy in the early part of the 19th century. The interesting thing to me about this is that the history of energy is not a history of substitution. It's not one form of energy replacing another. It's a history of addition. So if you look at coal, which is this gray here, I ask you to take your eye and sweep it across the entirety of this and pick out the place where coal peaked and declined to be replaced by the next better form of energy. Look at biomass, the same thing. Biomass consumption today is higher than has ever been seen over the course of this 150 years. The dramatic growth in population, the dramatic growth in income has required additions of energy to meet energy demand needs around the world, not substitution. So if you have a laptop, the laptop you have today might have replaced a laptop that was less capable. The one you have today is faster, or it has more memory, or it has more capability, and the one that you'll eventually replace that with, even more capable again. It's substitution, and that is the sort of thing that we experience often in our lives. But in the energy system, at least what we've seen in the last 150 years, is it's been a story of additions necessary in order to achieve the levels of energy demand that have come from a growing world. The other thing about the history that is not so obvious is that although it's always in change, the energy system, it doesn't change overnight. So Colonel Edwin Drake is widely credited with giving birth to the modern oil industry. He drilled a well in Titusville, Pennsylvania in 1859 near Oil Creek and set off what we would call the oil industry today. 1859 is the start of that industry. The blue on this chart is oil demand in the market overall for the world. And it's not till about 1965 that oil is a very large percentage of global energy demand. 100 years to take an energy source that is arguably much better than the sources that came before it. It's denser, it is more easily transportable, it has better energy to weight ratios. Everything about it, it makes it a more attractive form of energy, and yet it took the world's energy system 100 years to develop the infrastructure and the ability to consume it and support the demand in the world in a meaningful way. And so the energy system is always in evolution. It's been a history of additions, and it hasn't changed overnight. Those are things that history suggests to us. What about the future? Okay, the future, when we look at these two big macro drivers that drive energy demand overall, these are forecasts from the United Nations on the left in terms of population, and from an organization called the International Energy Agency on the right for global income. The International Energy Agency, or IEA, is an independent third-party organization. They're based in Paris. They're funded by governments of the world to help the governments in energy security issues, to advise them on energy security issues. So first, looking at this population here, the United Nations expects that the 7.7 billion people in the world today will grow by 2 billion people by 2050. It's 2 billion more energy consumers in the next 30 or so years. And the important thing about that population addition is it's not uniformly distributed around the world. We won't see much in the way of population additions in the United States or Northwest Europe. These additions will be in the developing parts of the world, Sub-Saharan Africa, developing parts of Asia, and elsewhere. And in those parts of the world, we would expect to see greater urbanization, a move of individuals into the middle class, and contributing to this rise in income that we see on the right. So we have growing population in the future, growing incomes in the future, in areas of the world that historically would cause greater demand in energy per person. This is the forecast of the future. And so what does that mean to forecasters as they forecast the energy system? So this is the overall energy demand for the last 20 years. And you see the dip down in 2020, now expanded a little bit from that first chart. Most forecasters get something that looks like this when they put that history together with the models of the views going forward. This gray shading here is a range of third-party forecasts, and I'm going to show you a couple different charts of forecasts today. Every time I show you a forecast of the future, you should think mentally it's wrong. Forecasting the future is incredibly hard to do. You have to make a variety of assumptions, and we have a history of past forecasts that turn out to be inaccurate. But looking at views of the future are helpful, especially to detect patterns and to understand what might matter more than most. And one of the things that comes out of a whole range of forecasts, including the two I've highlighted here from the IEA, which are the two blue lines, is growing energy demand overall into the future. In some cases, those forecasts are 20 to 25% more energy demanded by 2050 than today. Very consistent with the sort of history that we've seen in the world. Now, these forecasts typically are not simple extrapolations of the past. They will account for efficiency improvements that have existed in the world, and so they generally forecast even more efficient worlds in the future. They will assume adoption of policies which have been announced, so it's not a business as we know it today world, but a business of the future world with certain policies. But nevertheless, those strong tailwinds of more people in the planet and higher incomes creating greater demand for energy causes most forecasters to see more energy demanded in the future. Now, these aren't the only trends that are important for the future of energy. In 2015, governments of the world came together to deal with the issue of climate. Climate change is real. And there are serious people in the world that are coming together to deal with this issue. In 2015, the governments of the world came together and agreed on the Paris Agreement, or what is known as the Paris Agreement, which was ultimately ratified in 2016. It's governments that are signatories to that agreement. And that agreement seeks to hold warming of the Earth's atmosphere to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. CO2 in the atmosphere is rising from a variety of reasons. CO2 is a greenhouse gas that causes global warming, and that activity, this agreement seeks to abate. So to hold global warming by, or to well below 2 degrees Celsius, with an ambition to hold it to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is even a more challenging thing. The method of doing that the agreement specifies is to ultimately balance greenhouse gas emissions. CO2 emissions is what's talked most about, although there are other things that are also important. And so that sometime in the second half of this century, 2050 or beyond, the world will have achieved a balance of emissions so that any emissions that are incrementally going into the atmosphere in the second half of the century are balanced by some activity which is pulling emissions out of the atmosphere. The pluses and the minuses equal out, and people will commonly refer to that as net zero. No incremental emissions to the atmosphere, and that is the concept to hold temperature below 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees. Since 2016, the governments of the world that signed this agreement, which are nearly 200 in number, have met on an annual or near annual basis. Pandemic got in the way of their meetings as well, on a near annual basis to talk about the implementation of the Paris Agreement. And at the end of last year, the countries that are shaded here on this map have adopted, in support of that agreement, a net zero ambition statement of some kind. Some have enacted it into law, some have proposed a law, and some have just stated at this point as a policy ambition. But it reflects the seriousness with which global governments are approaching this very important topic. And important to note that although on the map it looks like, well, that's not the whole world, there's a lot of gray in here. All the largest economies of the world are part of these ambition statements. The United States, China, Japan, Germany, and other countries. And by most estimates, 90% of the world's economy is now operating under some form of a net zero ambition statement. So it's an important factor in how we think about energy going forward. The future of energy, in our view at Chevron, is lower carbon. And one of the reasons it's lower carbon is the commitment of the world to work on this particular situation. What that causes forecasters to do then is they can't forecast from the past what something like that might look like. So instead, they take the endpoint, the objective, the net zero by a particular date. For some forecasts, it's 2050, for some it's 2070, for some it's some other date, and they work backwards through a series of assumptions in order to accomplish the end objective. And those forecasts tend to look something like this. Again, a gray shading around a whole suite of forecasts. I've highlighted a couple here in these green lines that I'll show you more about in a second. All 4 of these, by the way, are from that International Energy Agency, so different scenarios. These you really wouldn't call forecasts per se because they have to make a series of assumptions in order to make the end objective work. In particular, they count on the advancement and deployment at scale of a large number of technologies. In the case of this IEA net zero scenario, 50% of the technologies that are inside that scenario are in the prototype or demonstration phase today. And so there is a great reliance on things that are yet to occur in order to make these scenarios here occur. Again, all of the data, all of the graph from the center from 2020 to the right are forecasts. You should think they're wrong. The point of these is not which one of these is right, but there is a sweep of forecasts in the future, and whether the world trends in this direction, which is what is currently happening today as we come out of the pandemic, or down this direction, or somewhere in between, today is a little unknowable because it is a function of many factors and actions yet to be taken. But if you look inside of the forecast, so these 4 bars right here are the distribution of energy from those 4 lines I showed earlier in 2040. The far left-hand side here is 2019. So the last year before the pandemic, it's a good reference place. In 2019, about 80% of the world's energy was provided by fossil fuels. We have a fossil fuel-based energy system in the world. Coal here in gray, oil and gas, oil blue, gas red, representing about 50% of the energy mix overall. And combined with coal, about 80% of today's energy system is fossil fuel-based. In those scenarios that went up and to the right a little bit, you can see the overall bar is taller, meaning the amount of energy anticipated in those scenarios is much greater. But maybe the thing that would surprise you about those scenarios, this light green is wind and solar. In those scenarios, in fact, in most scenarios, wind and solar is anticipated to be the fastest growing form of energy. It's growing off a very small base, but as costs continue to decline and as policy continues to support the deployment of that form of energy, it's expected to grow pretty dramatically. A lot of people will refer to these upper forecasts as business as usual forecasts. They're not. They're a forecast of how the world will evolve under a certain set of circumstances. And that includes a dramatic growth in wind and solar. The other forecasts, overall anticipate much greater levels of efficiency in the world because they still achieve the same population growth and the same income as these first forecasts. But the thing that I find people are most surprised by is that oil and gas, the red and the blue, are still part of the mix. In fact, one of the takeaways that I would propose to you is that across all of these scenarios, you don't see a single color. The solution of the future does not depend on us moving to one form of energy or another. In fact, it's highly unlikely that's the case because of the nature of the energy system around the world. Every country in the economy doesn't start in the same place. Every use of energy isn't equally suited for solutions of every kind. The green that you see here reflects the world becoming more electrified. And in all of these scenarios that occurs. But every aspect of the economy isn't easily electrified in the future. Now the question is, what will drive how this distribution of energy occurs? And it's generally considered to be 3 things: technology, policy, and consumer behavior. All 3 of those are important to decisions that are made in the world and determine whether one form of energy or another is sought to supply the demand that is created by population growth and income growth. Technology here is a pretty interesting one. This is technology adoption, and these are different lines for a variety of different technologies that reflect how much they've penetrated into the economy. One line that's of particular interest to me is there's a light gray line, and I apologize, it's kind of hard to see. It's right here in the mix. That's a North America smartphone. So maybe just going off script here a little bit. By show of hands, how many of you have a smartphone? Okay, I do too. How many have more than one? A few, okay. Why, nearly every hand in the room here went up. Why do we all have smartphones? Is there a UT university regulation that requires carrying a smartphone? Is there a government regulation? Is there a mandate? There isn't any of that. The reason we all, and I carry one too, actually I carry 2. The reason that I carry a smartphone is it meets my needs better than what I replaced it with. It's actually more expensive than what I replaced it with. What I had before was about $50. Smartphone is much more than that. But it has features you all are familiar with. It allows us to communicate directly with each other. I can get information, I can get weather. I can, get directed to places that I've never been before. It has features which suit me as a consumer better than the alternatives. And what we see across technologies is that those technologies which have a feature or a function that consumers prefer, they penetrate very quickly. So those things that offer features like a smartphone or have a different lower cost are technologies that penetrate very quickly. Other technologies, not so much. Like this blue line right here, that's dishwashers. So dishwashers are useful, but apparently not as much as others. When I was growing up, I had 2 brothers and a sister. We did not have a dishwasher. The 4 of us collectively were the dishwasher. And my parents made a different choice because it wasn't a requirement. It wasn't like what we as consumers have indicated around smartphones. This feature of technology is very important because technologies that are adopted deeply by economies are available and affect energy demand in the future. Those that are concepts but haven't found a way to penetrate the markets don't have nearly the same effect. You can see that as well in consumer preferences in terms of choices that consumers make. Last year, our best estimate is there were 6.6 million electric vehicles sold. At the same time, there were 35 million SUVs. Consumer preference. That doesn't mean it will be that way forever, but consumer preferences are strongly important to how energy is demanded by the world and then the choices of whether it's provided from one form or another. Policy here, also very important, and I wanted to dive just a little deeper into policy because policy establishes the rules of the game, so to speak, for a company like Chevron and other parts of society as we work towards a lower carbon future. This is an example of a marginal abatement cost curve. It is a way of displaying different alternatives to reduce carbon, to reduce CO2, reduce emissions in an economy. We actually have real ones of these inside of Chevron for our operations. And across the horizontal axis, from left to right, are the quantity of CO2 that can be abated. And on the vertical axis is the cost of doing so. And so when these curves are constructed, whoever's building them generally builds them in rank order. So those that are of the lowest cost are on the right, or excuse me, on the left, stacked all the way to the highest cost on the right. And these are a variety of different things that you can do to reduce CO2. This is the sort of thing that we need to concern ourselves with as we pursue the ambitions of the Paris Agreement. In the world today, there is about 50 gigatons of emissions, a bit more than 50 gigatons, 50 billion tons of CO2 equivalent emissions a year, of which a bit more than 30, about 33 gigatons or 33 billion tons is associated with the energy system. There are a variety of things that we can do as society to address those emissions. Some are high cost, some are less cost. And they show up on a marginal abatement cost curve like this. Some of them actually are profitable. These things that plot below this vertical line, those actually are negative cost or profitable. Actually, when you do them, they pay for themselves. And there are actual examples of that kind of thing. They are typically related to efficiency. Something that you do makes an operation more efficient, which pays for itself and reduces emissions at the same time. There are other things that are less so, and some options are very expensive. Policy is important because it guides what happens to these that are costs to the economy overall and yet are necessary to reduce emissions. If, as an economy, we adopt a price on carbon economy-wide and say adopted it at that price level right there, then everything to the left of this big blue bar here all becomes profitable and executable by for-profit companies in the economy. And policy has a direct implication on that. Policy can also attempt to pick winners and losers and might pick something over here that's very expensive that will abate carbon, but will do so at a high cost. The importance of this kind of concept is that what we are trying to accomplish as a society is a very large ask. I'm optimistic because we have lots of options, we have a lot of innovation in the world, but in order for the transition to work for all, it has to be done in a way that all can participate in it. All parts of the world aren't affluent enough to afford those kinds of solutions. And the more we can work on these sorts of solutions with the right policy support, the more success we're going to have. And this is especially important when we begin to consider parts of the economy that aren't easily electrified or aren't easily abated, like aviation, which might be better suited than attempting to electrify it by dropping in sustainable aviation fuel which can be consumed in aircraft of today, or we believe can be consumed in aircraft of today and have been, in order to reduce the carbon intensity of that. Sustainable aviation fuel is not made from a fossil feedstock, it's made from a renewable feedstock like soybean oil or animal fats. And its life cycle carbon emissions is very different than that is provided by fossil-based Jet A fuel that's used in airlines today. Heavy-duty transport could be maybe more appropriately decarbonized through the use of hydrogen. There's a variety of ways to make hydrogen. You can make it from renewable power, you can make it from natural gas with carbon capture, but there are a number of low-carbon ways to make that. Might be an actual better way to decarbonize that because of the load and weight requirements and the demands associated with heavy-duty transport. And then a variety of industrial processes that require high heat or consumption of something where you're burning the energy and capturing the combustion products of that energy and sequestering it underground through carbon capture. Those sorts of processes, if we're going to truly achieve net zero, because we have to abate these sectors, not the ones, only the ones that are easily electrified. In order to achieve all of that, having the right policy support so that these sorts of solutions move forward, can reduce in cost and gain traction, will be important to us achieving the ambitions of the Paris Agreement. One other thing that's important is that the transition is something that won't happen overnight. And along the way, if we're not careful and thoughtful as a society, we can get supply and demand out of sync with each other. And that has impacts in the world and in economies. This is a chart of Europe. This is natural gas demand in Europe for the last 20 years, this line. And although there's some ups and downs, natural gas demand in Europe is more or less been the same. Natural gas is the single largest source of energy across Europe. Production of natural gas in Europe, though, in response to some policy measures, is down over that same period, down by nearly 30% since 2015 in particular. And so during this period of time, Europe has gotten a bit more out of kilter between the availability of natural gas and the demand in that economy for it. And this winter, long before any of the current world events are going on, the availability of natural gas in the world, in Asia and in Europe, was limited. And predictably, prices, and this is the European gas price, which had been about maybe $7 over a long period of time, shot up to 35. Because supply and demand in this market weren't in sync with each other. So imagine anything that you do in your life that costs, say, $100 a month, and that thing is now $500 a month. And that thing is something you need, and you can't not do it. That's what folks in Europe are facing, or any part of this energy transition where supply and demand get out of sync with each other. If you're in this market and very affluent, this is an irritant. You're mad about it, you're unhappy about it, maybe you complain to your elected officials about it. But if you're in the vulnerable part of society, this forces you to make life choices, which are very challenging. And it comes about by, as we're evolving an energy transition, getting supply and demand out of kilter. Those things have to move together, and they won't move together overnight. But as a society, we need to be committed to a lower carbon future and finding ways to make all forms of energy, including natural gas, lower carbon in the future than it was in the past. So maybe a couple closing points for you. The first is beginning with this last point I made. As we're making the transition, which is not going to be an overnight event, it is not like getting the next app or the next software version because of the amount of installed capital in the world and how energy is consumed. Keeping supply and demand balanced through the transition is important so the transition works for all and doesn't become a negative event for those most vulnerable. The second point is that the world's going to need energy in multiple forms. The way we consume energy and the purposes for which we consume it are different. In many cases, things that we didn't used to electrify can be electrified in the future, but not in all cases. And as we look across a range of scenarios, in fact, I showed you 4, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, a body that works under the auspices of the UN, touched on almost 90 scenarios that are compliant with the 1.5 degree world. So there are many views of the future, and they all have multiple forms of energy as part of their solution space. And so we're going to need many forms of energy, which means we need to work on reducing the carbon intensity of all of them, because they're going to be part of the energy system for some time to come. And then the last point is collaboration is going to be critical to the future of energy. This isn't going to be solved by one company, one country, one sector. It's going to require the collaboration of all. It's going to require people that are in university today and take a place in a firm of some kind in the future. It's going to take researchers, it's going to take innovators, it's going to take policymakers, all to work together and play the role they have. Because the nature of the challenge we're facing is multifaceted, and it is not solvable by a single organization or a single sector of the economy. Collaboration will be essential to our success. So with that, I'm going to stop and see if there are any questions that I might be able to address.
Go ahead and stay up here. So yeah, well, raise your hand if you have a question, or come up to the microphone at the front. I think Beth. So I'll take, yeah, go ahead, Beth. I'll take the moderator's prerogative on first. So it's questions here. So you showed some of my favorite trends, which are that primary energy is essentially continued to increase since industrialization, and we haven't stopped using any one particular form of primary energy. And I can't tell if you were, one of your slides, you were attributing things to Nate Hagen's a colleague of mine, but we're both sort of fans of the idea of the economy as a superorganism that takes in materials and tries to become more efficient and grow. And that appears to be what the economy has done. So if we think about CO2 mitigation or low carbon, do we have to counteract these trends, which is to say, if we get more efficient, we use it to grow, but we have to change those gains from efficiency into CO2 mitigation as opposed to growth? Or do we have to actually, you know, some are obviously calling for stopping restrictions on some fuels as a way to mitigate carbon, but that would seemingly hinder growth as well. So do we have to overcome sort of this tendency of the superorganism, if you will?
Yeah, so the energy, most people refer to the energy as a system. It means it's connected together, you know, and are there any economists in the room? Okay, good, because I might say something that would offend an economist. So you'll hear economists, I work with a lot of economists, and they'll say, well, if we make this change, all things being equal. That all things being equal, not true. You change one thing and it changes something else, which changes something else. It's a system at the end of the day. That system has gotten more efficient. So we can create a unit of GDP with less energy today than we did 10 years ago, than we did 20 years ago. Most forecasters expect that will improve even further in the future. The problem with that a little bit is we've learned that when something gets easier to use, its use doesn't tend to go down, it goes up. And so if you know, LED light bulbs don't necessarily cause your energy use to go down maybe all on their own, because you might tend to leave the light on because it costs less to burn it. And so that factor is part of the system overall, and we are going to have to address some things to reduce the carbon intensity and emissions in the future in a way that we haven't in the past.
Right, okay, thank you. So we got...
Hi, Bruce.
Hi.
Thanks for coming here today.
Yeah.
I had a question for you about net zero 2050 targets and technology commercialization. And asking this question as someone who worked for a multinational to set targets like that on technology strategy, when do you think companies are going to have to actually start publicizing and putting those technology pathways on the table to be seen as credible both in the eyes of the public, but then also by investors and government, given that there's that tension of we can't tell you what we haven't invented yet?
Yeah, it's a good question, because there is some tension. There is a lot of interest in the world for ambition statements. They're typically long dated, like 2050, you know, and an organization will make a statement, we will be net zero in 2050. Almost always the person making that statement will not be the person that has to deliver on that, and that is an inherent challenge in that. Those sorts of statements can be useful in terms of direction setting. We ourselves have made a net zero aspiration statement for, and I'm going to go a little wonky here on you, for scope 1 and 2 emissions. So in emissions, there's a taxonomy. Scope 1 is what you as a company directly emit. So if we have a compressor and it's running on natural gas and the emissions coming off of that compressor are going in the atmosphere, that's our Scope 1 emissions. If we import electricity, we buy electricity off the grid to run the lights in our building, and that electricity provider is having emissions to generate the electricity, that's Scope 2, which are generally considered Scope 1 and 2 pretty directly controlled. So it's a net zero ambition statement or aspiration statement for 2050. Internally, we have a plan of how we will accomplish it, and we didn't make that statement until we did. But there are a lot of contingencies, and you're right. If you look on Chevron.com, and we've got a lot of information out there about sustainability, you will not see this particular plan because it is long dated and is dependent on a number of things: policy, work we do, partners, host governments, a variety of other things. To that, we pair shorter term targets. And we think it's important. If you're going to have a longer dated target, you have a longer objective, usually you pass different milestones or different things you accomplish along the way. So we've had a 2023 target, which we've accomplished. We now have a 2028 target, which are nearer dated, and there's more visibility about what we're doing to accomplish those. Investments that we're making to reduce carbon intensity in that regard. I think there will continue to be this tension to your question. I still think because of the nature of the 2050 targets or ambitions, because of the uncertainties associated with them, the clarity around them, how you will accomplish them will be a bit elusive. But it is important in our view that if an organization is making a 2050 ambition statement, that they're also clarifying what they intend to do in the near term. You know, who's the person you're talking to? What are they actually going to do? And so for us, those are targets. And then in addition to that, internal to Chevron, every Chevron employee or nearly every Chevron employee's pay on an annual basis is tied to our progress in those targets. So we've got plans, they're near dated, and we tie salaries to those outcomes. We think that creates a lot of attention, but it's still, you know, those longer dated targets by their nature, there's many uncertainties, and so you won't see the details. Also, I think it'll still be a while before that happens. It'll probably be till 2040 or 2045 before you see a lot of the details.
Any follow-up for that? You good? No. Okay, just making sure.
All right, one more from the audience. Go ahead.
Great talk. Michael Weber in mechanical engineering. You mentioned gas as a part of the future. I worked at Engie in Paris for several years, and our analysis was keeping gas in the mix would help you get to net zero more quickly, more cheaply, more reliably than a mix without gas, and I tend to believe that. And I wrote a piece a year ago in Scientific American arguing that gas should be part of a net zero future, but it won't be 1970s unscrubbed fossil gas. It'll be something else. And it only seems like there's a few ways, like fossil gas with carbon capture, like Gary Rochelle does, or fossil gas with direct air capture, biogas, maybe with or without capture, or maybe synthesized gas from hydrogen with or without capture. Do you have a view, or does Chevron have a view about which of those four, or which combination of those four, or are there other pathways, or something separate, like some other form of gas, ammonia or hydrogen? Is there a view on that, about where that will be to get to net zero?
Yeah, it's a great question. So one, I agree with you, Michael, that natural gas is part of the future. Natural gas depends on who's making the estimate and what their basis is. Relative to, say, coal, that it might displace is 65% lower emissions. Why wouldn't we do that? You know, sometimes in some circles of discussion, there's been the thought, no, we can't go from coal to natural gas. We have to go from coal to renewable power. But the grid can't handle that, or the loads or demand can't handle that. And so the perfect becomes the enemy of the good. There's a tremendous amount of progress we can make by deploying natural gas to a greater degree. And in this country, that exact thing has happened, and our emissions have dropped as a result of it. But your point is right. It can't be the natural gas of the past. It has to be lower carbon intensity gas. And I think there's probably going to be a mix associated with that. I think in its end use, say where natural gas is consumed, where you have a bunch of emitters in close proximity, that will get paired with carbon capture ultimately. And I think we're doing some renewable natural gas in California today, where we're taking methane, and methane, whether it's produced from a fossil source originally or the back end of a cow, methane is methane to the atmosphere. And so we are capturing methane from cow manure, processing it, putting it into the natural gas system in California, and then that ultimately goes into compressed natural gas vehicles. And that's a good pathway as well. The challenge with all of these is comparative costs. Renewable natural gas is pretty expensive. Carbon capture today is pretty expensive. We need some policy movement and we need some technology movement. You know, your question was, which of these is actually going to work? I don't know that we know which of those pathways is ultimately going to be the winner. So we would suggest we need to have policies that don't pick a path, but pick an objective. So an objective carbon intensity or a price on carbon, and let innovation drive costs down and figure out the best solutions for the particular demands that exist in the world. But natural gas, if we don't avail ourselves of natural gas, it makes a hard problem extremely challenging to accomplish in terms of a lower carbon future for the world overall.
All right. I have another question here. So if we think about Chevron, I guess, as a primarily U.S. based but international company, how do we think about Chevron compared to your peers in Europe or something like this, or Shell's, Total's, and Equinor's? I mean, you showed the policy chart, the map earlier, and you had the countries that have committed to climate policy, and I think all 3 or 4 or a few were in Europe. And some might perceive your European peers as being a little bit more proactive on CO2 mitigation. How does that relate to the policy environment you're in versus they're in? Is that critical to understand, or how should we compare you to your peers?
Yeah, so there are a lot of similarities. We're part of an organization called the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative, 12 companies that include national companies, there are European peers, American-based companies, and inside of those conversations, I would tell you there's more similarities than differences. There is this perception of differences, and where it comes from principally as our businesses that we've chosen to engage in. So many of our European peers have done 2 things. One, they've said they're going to grow renewable power very dramatically. And the second is that they're going to shrink their traditional oil and gas business. Some have given particular targets, like by 40% by a particular date. Renewable power, as I showed earlier, we think is going to grow faster than any form of energy. The question for us as a company is, can we add something distinct and unique to that? Renewable power is very mature today, and there are companies who are fully dedicated to doing that. And for us to take that on, we've concluded, and our investors have reinforced to us, that isn't a place that we think you as a company should play. We are deploying renewable power in support of our businesses to further decarbonize them. But the energy transition businesses that we're growing connect with our assets, capabilities, and customers. Those are things we think we can scale, those are things we can drop the costs on, and those we can make more readily available to society. So that includes renewable fuels, along which we made a rather large announcement yesterday, acquiring a company or intending to acquire a company for about $3 billion, the largest biodiesel producer in the United States. Hydrogen, where we have entered into a memorandum of understanding with Caterpillar, who builds engines, and so they will build engines that burn hydrogen in the future. And as an example, BNSF, which is a railroad, which has an end use. So we'll produce the hydrogen, we'll partner with somebody who will build an engine to burn it, and we'll have somebody who actually has a use for it. And BNSF is a current customer of ours, and so we have that existing relationship. We can create something of scale. And then carbon capture, which overlays our existing subsurface capabilities very well and builds off of a project we do in Western Australia called Gorgon, where we're engaged in carbon capture, and another in Canada called Quest, where we have an investment. When you look at those activities, us and our European peers, the amount of activity there is nearly identical. The difference is renewable power. And renewable power is going to be part of the mix, but we think we should be focused on those things where we have distinct advantage, because that's the stuff we can really scale and deliver real-world solutions around.
Right, thanks. Interesting. So I'd be kind of pleased if anybody has any other questions. Otherwise, I have one more here, or we can come up. Yeah, we can come up front. Yeah, go ahead there, at the front mic.
All right, thanks, Bruce, for the great talk. I have a question about scaling. So in terms of renewables, like the classic example of scaling was what China did with solar manufacturing. I mean, it seems to me like a company like Chevron would have the capital to scale solar in a way that would be difficult for other companies to do? So I've heard this argument a lot about, well, we don't think, we could scale it. There's nothing we could add. But from my perspective, I think it would be very easy for a company like Chevron to scale solar, for example. So I don't know if you can elaborate on that a little more.
Yeah, it's a good question. So we do have financial resources. The company that we announced the acquisition of yesterday was $3 billion. On top of that, this year, we'll spend $15 to $17 billion in this year's capital program alone. However, that capital, those monies are not our own. It's our investors. And our investors, and we're owned by our investors, and they speak very clearly to us about where they want us directing capital and not. They actually exit the company and exit their investment with us if we're directing capital in the wrong way. And so what they have said to us is, we don't want you to be investing in renewable power as a separate business line, because we as investors can do that ourselves. We can go buy company X where that's all they do, and we can create that in our portfolio if we want to. They do expect that it's a useful technology. It can reduce the carbon intensity of operations. They would expect we fully deploy it in support of our businesses, which is why we're doing that. But they have not supported us in terms of the capital allocation. And that's an important thing for, in our view, companies and different actors in society to figure out what they do well and play that role. Companies like Chevron aren't policymakers. Governments and policymakers need to do that. We're also not an academic institution. In some of the early stage research we can support, but some of that has to come out of an institution like the University of Texas. We need to be partnered with it, but we don't need to attempt to play the same role that the University of Texas does. And that extends to what we make in terms of decisions around which lines of business to invest in. And our investors have said, renewable power, it's mature, you don't have a history in that. Stick to the things that you can do that are differential, and we'll stay with you. And so that's the feedback that we get, but you're right. And so we'll use those financial resources to grow hydrogen, where we have a target to deliver 150,000 tons per annum by 2030. Carbon capture, 25 million tons per annum. Today in the world, there are 40 million tons per annum of carbon capture in the world. Our target is to add 25 million tons between now and 2030. It's a substantial increase. It will take all of our financial might to do that. And we have a target to produce 100 million barrels a day of renewable fuels, renewable diesel and sustainable aviation fuel by 2030 as well. That's where our capital will go, and we think those are solutions that are needed in the world. And so that's how we make that choice, but it's a good question.
Actually, Bruce, do you mind if I ask a question real quick, if there's no other questions? You're speaking to a group of people that are either just starting their careers or coming back to gain more knowledge for their careers, and you've given us a really great outline of the past, present, and hopeful future. And this is a broad question, so apologize. Do you have any advice for what questions they should be asking themselves as they go forward in their future employers, their future in energy, if you will? What should they be ticking in their brain as they're moving forward?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm a petroleum engineer by background. I think you may have identified me as a petroleum engineer. I'm a petroleum engineer by background. My very first class at university in petroleum engineering was Petroleum Engineering 201, Introduction to the Petroleum Business. Are there any petroleum engineers in the room? Do you all use Amex, Bass, and Whiting, that textbook? Okay, nobody asked. Okay, I just dated myself. So back in the day, this textbook, Amex, Bass, and Whiting, the three authors, was the seminal work for petroleum engineers. Every program throughout the country in petroleum engineering used this book. And one of those authors was the professor of that class, Introduction to Petroleum Engineering. And he said to all of us, one of the very first lectures of the semester, you missed it. You missed it. The energy industry was a great career, and it was wonderful, and I've enjoyed every minute that I've spent in it, but its heyday is past. Now, you're too far along in your academic pursuits, and so my advice to you is, he's saying this to us, complete your degree in petroleum engineering just as quickly as you can, and then switch industries as fast as you can, because nobody in this room will complete a career in the energy business. So I'm 37 years into the energy business. I am not done yet, but I like my chances. And what that professor wasn't able to see is the innovation that was going to exist and come forth in the world, and how things that he thought we had reached the end of the road on were things that we in the room solved, that you in the room will solve for us in the future. So my advice would be, spend your time in things that you love, because those will be things that you're good at. I will tell you that oil is going to be part of the mix for a long time, and we're going to need to deliver it in different ways in the future than we have in the past. We produce oil today in places that are so deep in the Gulf of Mexico we can't anchor a ship to them, and yet through the positioning devices we can hold the ship right over the location where we need to drill. We can produce gas and oil out of hydrocarbon formations, shale, the original source rock, that when I started was not even an option. We are producing oil and gas from places I couldn't imagine when I started, and that serves the needs of today in a way that we couldn't and weren't able to when I started. In the future, oil and gas are going to be part of the mix, but they're going to have to be provided in different ways, and they're going to need the engineers, the earth scientists, and other professionals to come together and solve those things. And there will be wind and solar, and there will be nuclear, and there will be hydro, and there will be biomass. There'll be many forms of energy. And so find in that space what you love and do that. And be a little suspicious, be a little thoughtful about individuals or views that purport to tell you how the world's actually going to work out. I spend my time in this every day. I can't tell you what it's going to look like, but I do know that energy is in great demand, and the provision of energy enables human progress. It allows us as humanity to lift ourselves from a former way of life into something more noble. Today, there are nearly 3 billion people in the world who don't have access to modern energy to cook. And as a result, indoor pollution alone kills millions every year. Nearly 1 billion people don't have access to electricity, and they are going to need energy in ways we haven't figured out yet. So be a part of the energy system, figure out which parts you like. Don't be dissuaded. Don't think that oil is not going to be part of it, or natural gas, or nuclear, or something else. It's all going to be part of the future, but it's going to have to be done differently. Huge challenges, and we'll need you and others to be able to solve those in order to meet the needs of the future. That's what I would say.
All right, well, that sounds like a good place to end. So thank you very much, Bruce Niemeyer, Chevron,
Thank you.
Vice President of Sustainability. Thank you. We'll be back, the online people will be back for Energy Week at 2 o'clock, programming at 2 o'clock. Thanks.